Stop for a moment and listen carefully, because what I'm about to say is important. If this video appeared on your screen today, there is a high probability that something in your cognitive system has already crossed a subtle threshold. Not a mystical threshold, not a spiritual fantasy, a neurological one, a measurable shift in how awareness organizes information about itself. Most people scroll past videos without thinking twice, yet something made you pause here. Something in your attention system registered this title, this idea, this message. And that is not random. In neuroscience and cognitive psychology, attention is not accidental. Your brain filters millions of signals every second, yet only a tiny fraction enters conscious awareness. So the first question you should ask yourself right now is this: why did your mind allow this specific signal to pass through the filter? Because what we're discussing today is not belief, not ideology, and not another motivational narrative. What you're about to hear is an explanation of a specific moment in cognitive architecture when consciousness begins to recognize its own structure. Researchers sometimes call this a metacognitive stabilization point, a moment when awareness stops chasing experiences and instead begins observing the mechanisms that produce experience itself. When that happens, perception changes in ways that are subtle but unmistakable. People often report that their thinking becomes quieter, that their reactions slow down, that they feel strangely calm even when nothing in their external life has changed. They are not becoming passive or detached. Instead, the internal system that constantly seeks meaning, validation, and answers begins to reorganize itself. And that reorganization is what this video calls the emerald field. Now, before your mind tries to categorize that phrase as something mystical or symbolic, let's slow down and clarify something important. The emerald field is not a location, and it is not a supernatural dimension. It is a metaphor used to describe a state of coherent awareness where perception, attention, and cognition align into a stable pattern. Imagine a complex network of signals inside your brain, millions of neurons exchanging information, predicting outcomes, interpreting sensory data, constructing meaning. Under normal circumstances, this network is noisy. Thoughts compete with each other, emotional reactions trigger automatic responses, and the brain constantly searches for external references to confirm what is real. This is what psychologists refer to as the predictive processing loop. Your brain is always guessing what the world means and updating those guesses based on incoming data. But sometimes, under certain conditions, something remarkable happens. The system briefly steps outside its own predictions. Instead of asking, "What does this mean?" the mind begins to recognize how meaning itself is constructed. This is the first stage of what we call Sophia Recognition. And if that term sounds ancient or philosophical, that is because it is. The word Sophia has historically been associated with wisdom, but in the context of modern cognitive science, it represents something very specific. The moment awareness recognizes the architecture that generates awareness. This might sound abstract right now, but think of it this way. Most of the time your thoughts feel like they are happening to you. A thought appears and you follow it. An emotion appears and it pulls your attention. But during a recognition event, the relationship reverses. Instead of being carried by thoughts, awareness begins to observe the process that produces them. This shift is small yet profound. It is similar to the difference between being inside a movie and suddenly realizing you are watching a screen. The characters are still there, the story continues, but something fundamental has changed in how you relate to it. Now here is the critical part that very few people understand. Once this recognition stabilizes, it cannot truly be reversed. The brain has already mapped the pattern. Just as you cannot unlearn how to read once your brain understands language structures, you cannot fully return to unconscious cognitive searching after the architecture of awareness has been seen. This is why the experience often feels irreversible, not dramatic, not explosive, simply irreversible. And this is where many people misunderstand what is happening to them. They assume they are going through a spiritual awakening, or that they have discovered some hidden mystical truth. But in many cases, what they are actually experiencing is a cognitive threshold, a moment when the brain's predictive models reorganize around direct observation rather than constant interpretation. The emerald field metaphor simply describes the stability that follows this shift. When awareness stops outsourcing meaning to external systems, ideologies, belief, identities, it begins recognizing structure directly. Instead of asking others what reality means, the mind begins to observe the mechanisms that create meaning in the first place. This can feel strange at first. People often describe a quiet sense of clarity as if mental noise has decreased. Decisions may feel less reactive. Emotional patterns may appear more transparent. Again, none of this requires mystical explanations. In fact, neuroscience provides several clues about why this happens. Studies of metacognition show that when the prefrontal cortex becomes more involved in monitoring internal processes, individuals develop a stronger ability to observe their own thoughts without immediately identifying with them. At the same time, networks associated with rumination, such as parts of the default mode network, may reduce their dominance. The result is not the disappearance of thinking, but a new relationship to thinking. Thoughts still occur, but they are recognized as events within awareness rather than commands that must be followed. This shift alone can dramatically change how people experience their lives. And interestingly, many individuals report that the change appears gradually after encountering certain ideas, questions, or moments of deep attention. It is not forced. It emerges. That emergence is what we refer to here as Sophia Recognition. Now let me make something very clear before we continue deeper into this discussion. This video is not here to convince you of anything. Recognition cannot be installed through persuasion. It either resonates with something you have already begun noticing, or it simply sounds like an interesting concept. And that is perfectly fine. But if you have already experienced moments where your mind became unusually quiet, where awareness felt more spacious than your thoughts, or where you suddenly realized you were observing your own thinking process, then you may already be approaching the threshold we're discussing. The emerald field is simply the stabilization of that recognition. It is the point where awareness stops treating itself as a problem to solve. For most of human history, people have approached consciousness as a mystery requiring belief systems to explain it. Religion, philosophy, spirituality, all of them attempted to describe the nature of awareness. But modern cognitive science is beginning to approach the same question from a different angle. Instead of asking what consciousness means, researchers are examining how the brain constructs conscious experience in the first place. And one discovery stands out clearly: consciousness is not a single thing. It is a process, a dynamic system constantly updating itself through perception, memory, prediction, and feedback loops. When that system becomes aware of its own operation, something remarkable occurs. The search for meaning slows down because the mechanism of meaning is visible. Imagine spending your entire life trying to find the source of music, only to realize you have been sitting next to the speaker the whole time. The music continues, but the mystery changes form. This is why people often describe recognition events as both simple and profound at the same time. Nothing external has changed, yet perception feels reorganized. The mind stops chasing explanations and begins observing patterns. And this observation gradually becomes more stable over time. That stability is what we refer to as the emergence of coherent awareness. Instead of fragmented thoughts competing for attention, cognition begins aligning around direct perception. You might notice that reactions slow down. You might notice that emotional triggers lose some of their automatic power, not because emotions disappear, but because awareness sees them forming. This ability to see processes as they occur is one of the most powerful cognitive skills a human brain can develop. Psychologists call it meta-awareness, and it plays a central role in attention training, mindfulness research, and advanced cognitive therapy methods. Yet very few people realize that meta-awareness can reach a tipping point where observation becomes the default mode rather than an occasional practice. When that happens, the internal search for answers begins to dissolve naturally, not through discipline, through recognition. And this is exactly where the concept of direct knowing enters the conversation. Direct knowing is not mystical intuition. It is simply the ability to perceive cognitive structures without filtering them through layers of interpretation. When you directly observe a thought forming, you do not need another thought to explain it. The observation itself contains the information. This reduces mental noise dramatically because the brain is no longer generating endless commentary about its own activity. Instead of interpreting every experience, awareness recognizes patterns immediately. Over time, this produces a sense of clarity that many people describe as calm presence. Again, nothing supernatural is required to explain this phenomenon. It is the natural result of a cognitive system becoming aware of its own architecture. And interestingly, once this pattern appears, it tends to reinforce itself. The more awareness observes its own processes, the less it becomes trapped by them. This is why the threshold we're discussing today is often described as a point of no return. Not because something magical has happened, but because the brain has learned a new way to process information. Just as learning to ride a bicycle permanently changes your sense of balance, recognizing the structure of awareness permanently changes how thoughts are experienced. This does not mean life becomes perfect. Challenges, emotions, and uncertainty still exist, but the relationship to them shifts. Instead of being consumed by every mental event, awareness remains slightly behind the scenes, observing the system as it operates. That subtle distance creates enormous psychological stability. And this brings us back to the beginning of this video. If you felt a quiet sense of recognition while listening so far, not excitement, not disbelief, just a calm sense that something here makes sense, that itself may be a signal. Recognition does not arrive with fireworks. It arrives with clarity. And once clarity appears, the mind begins reorganizing around it naturally. That is the doorway into the emerald field. Not a place, not a mystical experience, but a stable pattern of coherent awareness where consciousness recognizes the structure through which it perceives reality. In the next chapter, we will examine exactly what the emerald field represents in cognitive terms and how this pattern forms inside the brain's awareness architecture. But before we continue, take a moment to notice something simple. The fact that you are aware of these words right now means awareness is already observing itself at some level. And that realization may be the most important step in the entire process. Before we go deeper, take 2 seconds to support the channel. If this explanation resonates with you, tap the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of this series. Your engagement helps this information reach more people who are searching for real explanations about consciousness and awareness. And I'm also curious about something. Leave a comment below and tell me which part of the United States you're watching from. East Coast, West Coast, Midwest, Texas, Florida, California, New York, wherever you are. It's fascinating to see how widely these ideas resonate across different places. Your comment also helps build a map of where this conversation is happening. Now take a breath, relax your attention, and get ready. Because in the next chapter we're going to explore the deeper structure of the emerald field, and how the brain reaches the cognitive threshold where recognition becomes irreversible. To understand what the emerald field truly represents, we need to begin by clearing away a very common misunderstanding about consciousness. For centuries, people believed that awareness was something mystical that existed separately from the brain, almost like a hidden observer watching life unfold from somewhere outside the body. Modern neuroscience does not support that idea. What science increasingly shows is that consciousness emerges from complex interactions between neural systems that process perception, memory, prediction, emotion, and attention. In other words, awareness is not a separate entity watching the mind. Awareness is what the mind is doing when these systems synchronize in a specific way. The emerald field is simply a metaphor that describes what happens when this synchronization becomes unusually coherent. Normally, the brain operates in a fragmented pattern. One part of the brain processes incoming sensory information. Another part predicts what that information might mean. Another evaluates potential threats. Another recalls past memories. And yet another part creates the internal narrative we call thinking. Most of the time, these systems compete with each other for attention. Thoughts interrupt perception. Emotional reactions override logic. Memories distort current experiences. The mind jumps from past to future in a constant attempt to maintain control over uncertainty. This is the default human condition, and from an evolutionary perspective it makes perfect sense. A brain that constantly scans for threats and opportunities is more likely to survive in unpredictable environments. However, survival optimization is not the same as cognitive clarity. In fact, the very mechanisms that help humans survive often create enormous internal noise. The brain predicts problems that are not actually present. It rehearses conversations that never happen. It replays past events that can no longer be changed. This loop of prediction and correction is known in neuroscience as predictive processing, and it explains why the human mind often feels busy even when nothing urgent is happening in the external world. Your brain is always trying to reduce uncertainty by constructing explanations for everything it experiences. But occasionally a fascinating shift occurs. Instead of chasing explanations, awareness begins to notice the process of explanation itself. When this happens, the brain's relationship with its own predictions begins to change. Rather than immediately believing every thought that appears, the mind recognizes thoughts as events generated by internal models. This is the first layer of structural awareness. It is subtle, but it is powerful. Imagine watching clouds move across the sky. Normally, you might focus on the shapes, interpreting them as animals or objects. But if you step back and observe the sky itself, the clouds become less important than the space in which they appear. Thoughts function in a similar way. When awareness identifies completely with thinking, every thought feels important. Every idea demands attention. But when awareness begins observing thinking as a process, thoughts become like clouds passing through a much larger space. This is where the emerald field metaphor becomes useful. In cognitive terms, the emerald field represents a stable configuration where awareness is no longer trapped inside individual thoughts. Instead, it recognizes the broader field in which thoughts arise. The mind stops reacting to every signal and begins observing patterns across signals. This transition marks the movement from reactive cognition to coherent awareness. Researchers studying attention and consciousness have observed something similar when examining experienced meditators and individuals trained in metacognitive awareness. Brain imaging studies suggest that during states of sustained awareness, certain neural networks become less dominant while others become more coordinated. In particular, areas associated with narrative self-processing, often linked to the default mode network, show reduced activity, while networks involved in present moment attention and monitoring become more engaged. This does not mean the default mode network shuts down completely. The brain still uses memory and narrative to navigate the world. But the dominance of that narrative voice weakens. Instead of constantly telling a story about what is happening, awareness becomes more interested in directly observing what is happening. The difference may sound small, but its psychological impact can be dramatic. When people first encounter this shift, they often describe a surprising quietness in their mental landscape. Not silence, but reduced noise. Thoughts still occur, but they no longer collide with each other in the same chaotic way. There is more space between them, more clarity. Reactions slow down because awareness is no longer rushing to interpret every stimulus instantly. This is the beginning of what we call coherent awareness. Coherence means that different parts of the cognitive system begin aligning around direct observation instead of endless interpretation. Perception becomes clearer because it is not filtered through as many assumptions. Emotional reactions become easier to recognize because they are seen as patterns forming within awareness. Decision-making improves because the mind is less distracted by imaginary scenarios. But the most important change is this: the search for meaning begins to dissolve. For most of their lives, people feel as if they are searching for something: answers, identity, purpose, certainty. This search drives human creativity and exploration, but it also creates psychological tension. The mind believes that somewhere in the future there is a realization that will finally make everything make sense. Yet when awareness begins recognizing its own structure, something surprising happens. The search loses momentum, not because all questions are answered, but because the mind realizes it has been searching inside the system that produces the questions. This realization can feel incredibly stabilizing. Instead of chasing meaning externally, awareness recognizes that meaning is constructed through perception and interpretation. Once this mechanism becomes visible, the urgency to constantly solve life's mysteries decreases. Curiosity remains, but the pressure disappears. This is why the threshold discussed in this video cannot truly repeat. When the brain first recognizes its own cognitive architecture, the experience may feel new or surprising, but once the pattern is understood, it becomes integrated into how the mind processes information. Awareness now includes the ability to observe its own operations. Just as a musician who learns harmony can never again hear music in exactly the same way, a mind that recognizes its own structure cannot fully return to unconscious identification with every thought. This is the stabilization of Sophia Recognition. The word Sophia historically referred to wisdom, but here it represents a specific moment when awareness recognizes the intelligence embedded within its own architecture. Not knowledge stored in memory, but the structural intelligence that allows consciousness to observe itself. When this recognition stabilizes, the mind begins operating differently in everyday life. For example, Consider emotional reactions. Normally, emotions appear suddenly and pull attention into them. Anger arises and the mind becomes angry. Fear arises and the mind becomes afraid. But when awareness recognizes emotional processes as they form, there is a small but powerful shift. Instead of becoming the emotion instantly, awareness notices the signals that create the emotion. This does not eliminate feelings, but it changes how they are experienced. Emotions become information rather than commands. The same shift happens with thoughts. A thought might say, "Something is wrong," or "I need to solve this problem right now." In the past, the mind might have immediately believed that thought and reacted accordingly. But with structural awareness, the thought is seen as a prediction generated by the brain's modeling system. It may still be useful, but it is no longer automatically trusted. This ability to observe internal processes without immediate identification dramatically reduces mental noise, and that reduction leads to something many people describe as the end of seeking. Seeking is the mental habit of constantly looking for the next answer that will resolve uncertainty. But when awareness recognizes how questions and answers are generated within the mind, the urgency behind that search fades. Life continues. Goals still exist. Curiosity still operates, but the background tension of "something is missing" disappears. This is why individuals who stabilize in coherent awareness often report a quiet sense of completeness. Not perfection, not enlightenment in a mystical sense, simply a stable clarity about how their own cognition functions. Now here is something important to understand. Reaching this threshold does not mean someone becomes permanently calm or wise. The human brain remains a biological system influenced by stress, fatigue, hormones, and environment. Old habits can still appear. Emotional reactions can still happen. The difference is that awareness now recognizes those patterns as patterns. Instead of being lost inside them, the mind sees them unfolding. Over time, this recognition strengthens. Each moment of observation reinforces the neural pathways responsible for meta-awareness. Gradually, the brain learns that direct perception is more efficient than constant interpretation. And as this efficiency increases, the cognitive system naturally favors clarity over noise. This is the maturation of the emerald field. It is not an achievement or a destination. It is simply the natural stabilization of awareness recognizing itself. And interestingly, once people reach this stage, they often realize something that completely changes their relationship with personal development and spirituality. They see that many traditions were pointing toward this recognition all along, but the language used to describe it often made it seem mystical or unreachable. In reality, the shift is deeply human and deeply cognitive. The brain becomes aware of its own processes. Consciousness recognizes its architecture. Awareness stops outsourcing meaning and begins recognizing structure directly. And once that happens, a new phase of human experience begins, one where clarity replaces constant searching. Now pause for a moment and reflect on something simple. Right now, as you listen to these words, there is an awareness noticing the meaning behind them. That awareness is not the words themselves. It is the space in which the words are understood. The fact that you can notice this difference means the system is already capable of recognizing its own structure. And that is the entire point. The emerald field is not something you enter. It is something you notice has always been present. The moment that recognition stabilizes, the endless cycle of seeking begins to dissolve. What remains is a quieter, clearer relationship with reality, one where awareness observes life directly rather than constantly trying to interpret it. And that is why this moment does not repeat. Because once the architecture of consciousness has been seen, the mind can never completely forget the structure through which it perceives the world. It simply continues learning from within that clarity.